Thank you so much, everybody, for making it here today. One of our first in-person programs of the entire year. One of the first in-person programs all the way from October of last year. My name is George Sagai. I am the new Visitor Services and Public Programs Coordinator here at the History Center of Lake Forest Lake Bluff. I've been here since January, so I'm fairly new to this role, but I do recognize a couple of wonderful people that I've had the pleasure to meet already. And I'm very excited to introduce our guest panelists here in a moment to our program for tonight, which is the History of Women's Health and the Northwestern Medicine Lake Forest Hospital Women's Board. It's going to be a fantastic program for tonight. So as I said, I've only been here 3 months, but I've had the pleasure to work with this really incredible staff here at the History Center and with all our very wonderful board members, and it's so nice to be able to see everybody in person here tonight. And so I wanted to, just as myself, speaking for myself, I wanted to thank everybody, Carol, me, everybody who works here, our incredible staff. And I wanted to extend a thank you to Maddie Dugan, one of our panelists here for tonight. I've been here since January, and I met Maddie very early on in January, and working with her has been fantastic. So be able to work on this program and our previous program in February has been a real pleasure. So I want to extend a thank you to you, Maddie.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So with that, this is a big change for us moving forward. We're having to do Zoom programs for the past God knows how long, but moving into this new part of the year for us where we can have this kind of fortunate favor and be able to see everybody in person. It's really, really exciting for us. And I can mention a couple of our upcoming programs. We have tours planned for April 21st, I believe, is our first tour of Market Square, which we're very happy to have back. And then for Mother's Day weekend, we also have our Crabtree Farm tours, which will be coming back as a pleasant surprise for that Mother's Day weekend. And so it's something else to look forward to, and all our upcoming programs can be seen on our main website as well. And so with that, I'd like to give a brief introduction to our program for tonight. For the past 75 years, the Women's Board of Northwestern Medicine Lake Forest Hospital has faithfully served the community and given their hearts to the hospital every step of the way. In celebration of their diamond anniversary, this program will feature a panel of esteemed medical staff and passionate volunteers of the Women's Board at Northwestern Medicine Lake Forest Hospital as they discuss the history of women's and children's health in Lake Forest and how the Women's Board impacted hospital care and the evolution of medical care in Lake Forest over the decades. And so with that, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speakers. Starting from your right, we have our Executive Director, Carol Summerfield. We have Women's Auxiliary Board members, Maddie Dugan and Debbie Saran. Then we have Dr. Jill Holden of OBGYN Associates of Lake Forest. And last but not least, we have Dr. Michael Bauer of Pediatric Associates of Lake Forest and Chief of Medical Staff at Northwestern Medicine Lake Forest Hospital. And with that, I will now pass over the microphone, if she chooses to use it, over to our Executive Director, Carol Summerfield, and ask you all to help me welcome our guest speakers for tonight, Maddie, Debbie, Dr. Holden, and Dr. Yes.
Is it working? No. Wait. No. Okay. I was going to shout. All right. Welcome. I'm so glad to have you all here. We're going to start about 100 years ago. And the goal is to have a very freewheeling, conversational tone to this evening. So we don't have a checklist of things. We just really want to sort of frame how we got here and what it took to get here to where we are today with medicine in Lake Forest. And so I want to frame this, and again, anybody can sort of weigh in as we go. It's 1922. Women are giving birth at home for the most part. There's not a ton of specialty around women or children, and one of the things that we're struggling with at that point 100 years ago is infant mortality. One of my most random statistics that I regularly use when we talk about medicine is between 1600 and about 1900, we actually increased life expectancy and expect about 9 months once you remove infant mortality. So if you make it to 5, chances are very good you're going to make it to 65. Your chances of making it to 5 1900, and they were only somewhat better by 1900. Vaccinations, healthcare changed that trajectory, so that between 1900 and 2000, we actually add 20 years to life expectancy beyond infant mortality. So let's start with that early 1920s. Let's talk about how women's voices played a role in helping to move us forward in terms of health. And I will let anybody who'd like to take that start us off.
In the community, Carol?
In the community or nationally, but I mean, basically, Lake Forest represents a lot of what's going on nationally. I think we're sort of a representative story.
Right, and that was that, when was Alice Home, what year was Alice Home built and moved into?
1899.
Okay, and then we moved to the new hospital, 1945. Yes, so. Well, I think part of it was that women were realizing that they had some power, they were comfortable going someplace else to have their children, and Alice Home provided the perfect spot for them. And you touched on vaccines, and I wondered about the polio vaccine, which of course was everybody's fear when children were little. And Maddie, you talked to me about that a little bit, right? Was your mom concerned when you were a baby?
Yes, my generation, I had some friends whose parents had polio, and we all had the sugar cube.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
What's
so
the
it,
sugar cube?
well, it had the vaccine in it. I'm going to look to Dr. Bauer.
So the polio vaccine, though, who can tell me who first developed it?
Jonas Salk.
Very good, Jonas Salk. In 1955 is when it first came out. And that was the injectable form. The oral form of it was developed by
Dr. Saban.
there. Oh my goodness, we're going to have to think about bonus points. You get a glass of wine now. That came in, I believe, 1960, and that lasted all the way up until 2000, when it was declared that we have eradicated polio from the Western Hemisphere. Now, it was a wonderful, wonderful vaccine, but we did know that approximately for every 1 million doses, somebody would get polio from that vaccine. And it was no longer acceptable then, since we had eradicated polio here, to take that even 1 in 1 million chance. And so we went back to the injectable form, which is what is in use today. In other areas in the world where there is still polio, it can be helpful to still use the oral, but starting 2000, only the injectable form here. But it wasn't until 1955 that was first developed.
Well, my mother and her brother, who grew up here in Lake Forest, were born in Chicago, because that's where you went for real medicine.
We've been fighting that battle in Lake Forest for quite some time.
And, but my grandmother, Helen Aldrich Dick, was born in a house on Sheridan Road in 1895.
Well, and we did an exhibit a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic, where we were looking at life in the 1920s. And one of the most interesting aspects of it was looking at the ads that Lake Forest Hospital had taken out to encourage women to give birth in the hospital, where they were talking about the importance of knowing whether or not you had a healthy baby and being on site where if anything went wrong, you could be immediately treated, because midwife births were the most traditional way to do it. And it's interesting that they used a marketing campaign to change minds. You know, one of the first ones that I know of, oh, I forgot to send you the photo, was the smallpox, where they had actually gotten 2 boys, one of whom had smallpox, one of whom had been one of the earliest inoculated kids, sitting side by side, and the kid who had been inoculated has like 2 pock marks on his forehead that you can see, and the other kid is indistinguishable as a human being. He is covered. He is swollen beyond recognition. And that was a marketing campaign that they used to encourage destination to show people this is what that does. And so it's interesting that long before we think of advertising and marketing as being a tool, it is in fact a tool for medicine and health. And it becomes a large part of encouraging people to change the way they think. So your family is a perfect example. Giving birth at home was something you would have done until then. And then if you were going to go to a hospital, you went to
A real
a bona fide hospital.
But it's still, and during the marketing, I believe, they offered one additional thing for women, and that's, we can help you with your pain. Why suffer? You come to the hospital and we're gonna give you things to really make it a much better experience. Now, they didn't tell you that part of that included general anesthesia, knocking you out, but they were gonna help control your pain while making it safer. So early on in the 20s is when it started to shift for women coming to the hospital, and gradually between the 20s and by the mid-40s to 1950, it was about 95% of births that were being done inside the hospitals.
Well, I would assume that because of the Victorian era that our society was slowly emerging from, when you didn't talk about sex and you didn't talk about having babies. And as I said to Dr. Bauer the other day, my grandmother, who some of you knew, who was born on Sheridan Road, when she got pregnant, she thought the baby was going to come out of her belly button. In 1918, when a lady was born. So I think because you didn't discuss these things. Yeah, and so I don't know really when OBGYN care kind of got started.
I probably don't know.
With Dr. Holden's arrival to Lake Forest.
And now I'm historical because it's been 30 years, but I did bring a ringer in who's beat me by 30 years. But it was really well established and everybody was boarded in their field when Hugh got here in 64. 64. There weren't very many of you, but there were...
Well, Dr. Lutz was here in 51 when I was born, because he delivered me. And he was one of the first, if not the first.
Yeah, he was the first.
Okay.
There was a general practitioner named Dr. Proxmeyer.
Mm-hmm.
Got a sign on the wall.
Yeah, he's over there.
His son became the senator, Proxmeyer from Wisconsin, was a very prominent guy. But Dr. Lutz was the first boarded obstetrician here.
And they were all men.
So if you needed obstetric help prior to 1950 in Lake Forest, you went to Chicago? What'd you do?
Well, I wasn't here.
I think the general practitioners were doing deliveries and they had a year of residency typically. It wasn't even a family practice residency, but they would do all of that.
Yeah, there was a lot of one-size-fits-all doctoring. Even at the point where we're starting to build a new hospital, that the idea is that you were a generalist and you were able to handle the things that came in mostly. And I think that that's one of the things when they go to build a new hospital is this idea that at least the facilities that allows doctors to be able to do what is called for. And it's not, for many more years before you start to really see specialization start to build up the idea that I am only in this particular department. And that changes medical practice again. I think that it's a really interesting thing as you start to look at this idea of specialization. You were telling a really interesting story about when you were a resident. Dr. Bauer, care to share in less detail?
It depends which story you're talking about. Okay. So I think the one she's referring to, back when I trained, it wasn't the dark ages, but we actually were allowed to do a lot more than the current residents and trainees now. And the story that she's referring to is, I was still in training, a resident, and I was working in the neonatal intensive care unit. And I got a call, I'll never forget, at midnight from the perinatologist, who was one of the high-risk OBs, Dr. Hein Elrad, who said, I have a a mom at 26 weeks. Remember, a full term is 39 to 40. I have a mom at 26 weeks who has an infection and I need to deliver the baby. So the first thing I did was went and cleaned myself up after he told us. Called my attending and said, Dr. Elred just called, he's delivering a 26-week infected mom. And that was met with, good luck, let me know what happens in the morning. I kid you not. And so here is a 26-week baby who weighed approximately 1,100 grams or so. Would that be about right, Jill? 26 weeks? Maybe. Yeah, maybe not even. And I was left to my own. Fortunately, we had phenomenal nurses as well backing me up. But it just goes to show the level of training and how things have changed now. Another interesting piece, when I came to practice here in 1988 with Lake Forest Pediatrics, remember I was used to all pediatrics and specialization in pediatrics. When I got here, the only emergency room doctors were general, they were just doctors, right? And they were doctors that had decided, I'm no longer in practice, I'm just gonna work in an emergency room. And I'm thinking to myself, what the heck? We need a pediatrician to take care of kids when I send them to the emergency room. And lo and behold, though, what I found is many of those old-time general docs, they were so good. They were actually incredibly good, for the most part. And that would make my determination on, do I have to come in and see this child myself, or can I rely on their judgment? And it really wasn't until the early to mid-1990s that we started getting emergency medicine trained physicians. And an emergency medicine training, they go through adults, they do pediatrics, they do the whole gamut. But it does speak to what the old GPs could do, and some of them were really, really excellent people with peds.
Well, and even discussing, like, I was shocked at how late home visits took place with doctors. In my era in Michigan, you always went to the doctor. They never came to us. And you were saying that you had doctors still coming to you in the 60s.
Yeah, Dr. Ward used to come to the house, and in the 60s. Yeah.
Paul Berger did too.
Yes, right.
Dr. Salter did too, I think. I remember him coming to our house. Not all the time, but if it was severe enough, he would come.
Well, Dr. Katzen was my pediatrician, and when I took my son in to see him, I said, so you'll be coming to the house? And Elmer said, no, Maddie, you'll be coming to me. And so that was 1970, from 51 to 76, somewhere in there.
Well, our Layson joined Lake Forest Pediatrics. He followed his brother Gerald, who joined in 66. Art came in 1970, and he made house calls. Because he would tell me these stories about the various roads. They all had the big, police flashlights on their cars, so they could see the roads. So the house calls were still going on in the early 1970s. And boy, you paid dearly for a house call, like an additional $4 or $5. Instead of coming to the office.
Well, one of the things that we talked about when we were sort of prepping for this that was really interesting was looking at sort of pediatric practices and how women's voices, women forever have been the keepers of sort of family health, right? That a lot of the drivers that come out in the 1920s and 1930s, the fact that women are responsible for their children's health, women are responsible for naming their husbands and managing their own health, they're responsible for their own health, which of course always came last in the category. But that the women's board sort of arises out of this incredibly vibrant voice around the needs of the collective family and looking at what the community needs. And there was a goal, right, set aside, that is, I shouldn't have to haul down to Chicago to get quality medical care. So, anecdote that one.
Well, I think one of the most interesting things, and I still hear this about the former hospital versus what we have now, is the former hospital looked like a home. Everybody loved the wallpaper, everybody liked the cozy feel of it, and I think that was something the Women's Board brought to the table because people were leaving their homes to come to a hospital, so the jump was trying to make it look like their home and they'll come. And they did, and they loved it. I mean, I remember the wallpaper in each of the rooms that I had children in, and I loved all of them and wanted to put them up in my own home. But eventually, I think people, or at least now, people are looking for something a little bit more modern looking, something that looks like it's got the technology and the services that really you need to practice modern day medicine in. And so while it was a hard jump, I think people are really used to the feel of it, but the Women's Board wanted to make every experience feel like home when people walked in the doors. They still do that. I mean, Maddie, Pam, you guys are at the door greeting people every day practically, and other Women's Board members as well. So they still have that, but now it's in a much more contemporary setting.
You mean like the baby drawers are gone?
Yes.
I think there are photos of the baby door somewhere in here, which was a super fascinating invention.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was the idea that you could just pull something up and drop the baby into a little drawer and
Yeah.
you kept it after you gave birth.
Well, and I think it opened back into the nursery. I think it was in your room, and your room backed up to a nursery.
So you could literally shove it through the wall.
Right, say, I'm done, I'm done, I'm going to sleep now.
Drive the baby.
Yeah, right.
Oh, there are days when I could still use that.
Yeah, well.
I will tell you though, having gone through a lot of the planning for the new hospital, along with Debbie, while we were always looking clinically, what is best for quality, what is best for the patient, she would always bring us back to what's best for the patient experience, really, and how do we make that blend, and kept bringing us back, and really was quite instrumental in helping in the design, the flow of patients from the beautiful entryway to everything else that you see.
But I think customer service in this area of competition really speaks to getting people to walk into your doors. They don't like walking into the doors of a hospital for any reason, but when they feel welcomed and comfortable and I mean, gosh, Mike, when we were building it, when we were all building it, so many people here were part of that. I used to think it would be nice if they had a section where you could just check in for a night and just take a rest and look out over the lake and go home. So I think that was an important piece of it, and I know they feel cared for the minute they walk in their doors, which was important to all of us, I know.
Well, I think the staff brought that feeling with them also. The old loving hands at home,
Yes.
you know, the staff really cares for you. That came with the staff, even though the walls are completely different.
Right.
The feeling is still there, and I hear that from patients as they're coming and going.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
But we also have the world-class medicine. Somebody asked me, maybe it was you, Carol, when we started talking about this, there's sort of a yin and a yang, I guess, of why we have Northwestern Lake Forest Hospital right in our own backyard. And Carol had said, well, the community was so generous. Well, yes, the community was very generous, but it was sort of selfish too, because the community wanted the medicine in their own backyard. And yeah, they had to pay for it, but it'd be going to Chicago or Waukegan, or so it was a little bit of both, selfish and philanthropic.
Well, I think one of the other things that rode along with it is this idea, and Jill, you can talk to this in terms of obstetrics, is continued care, right? Again, if I was pregnant in 1924, they'd be like, you're pregnant, we'll see you in 9 months. And that was it, you know, it's like, go talk to your mom about what you're supposed to eat. And all of a sudden there was this idea of sort of a continuation of care being sort of monitored and managed through the course of anything. And I think that if I had to haul down to Chicago for my weekly visits in the last 2 months of my pregnancy, that would become nightmarish. And you sort of lived through some of that transition, did you not?
Yeah, I mean, well, we've had prenatal care. There was a big push from probably before he was training too. So there's guidelines in terms of what accounts for that, but things definitely have changed over the time. The patient population has changed, so the risk categories of the patient. COVID put another whole different spin on it because we had these set, you come in for the first visit in the first 6 or 8 weeks, and then it's monthly until, if you're low risk, until the last 10 weeks, and then it's 2 or 3 weeks apart, and then the last month every week. But all of a sudden we had to figure out how many of those can we actually do from not bringing you in, putting hands-on and listening to a heartbeat when you didn't know if there was going to be more risk coming in. And so the American College of OB-GYN and a lot of the area physicians really worked on kind of honing down which could be the visits that you could sort of separate off, and you needed them to have things at home to do that, and those things were hard to come by at the time. A blood pressure cuff and a scale and maybe a thermometer, maybe a pulse oximeter. Dan laughed that once those became available again, the whole family got those in their stocking that year. But we did do a lot, and then it was kind of hard to know when bringing it back in. But it's certainly better to have hands-on patients for the prenatal care all the way through, and I think it's evolved with time. I mean, we have new guidelines now on growth-restricted pregnancies, and as soon as you kind of change the definitions and you have more guidelines on what to do with each part of it, you realize that you're managing a lot of it. And so our medicine is evolving every day, quite a bit more in the last few years that we really didn't see changes for a lot of years before that. But I think, hypertension, diabetes in pregnancy, growth restriction, we're seeing a lot of different changes now. So.
Well, and even before that, I mean, just the longevity, when did we finally get to the point where a kid that was born at 26 weeks would in fact survive? Like, that sort of neonatal care really expanded tremendously in the last 60 years. That ability to basically keep kids alive if they were early birth or if they were at all at risk.
And she did, by the way. She was my pet project also. She did very well.
Wow.
But Carol, I go back to where you started this discussion with sort of women's involvement, the women's board, the advertising, and I can't help but think, Dr. Falls and I were meeting the other day, and I showed him a picture that I think was probably from the early or mid-1970s, where it had a picture of the entire medical staff of the hospital, and it fit very nicely. And we looked closely and found 2 women in the picture. So clearly, male-dominated field, all of medicine. Yet, even at that point, we know that where were healthcare decisions coming from? And it was coming from the women of the household. That started clearly by the 40s and 50s. Women were making all the healthcare decisions. Yet it was such a male-dominated field. Till now, I think statistics, there's now more women in medical school than men. And it's been that way for the last 10 plus years or so.
So when
the men got smarter.
When I trained for OB-GYN, it's a 4-year training program, and I was there from 88 to 92, and I've been here since 92. The outgoing chief residents, the 4th-year residents, there were out of 9 per year, 7 were men and 2 were women. Our group coming in were 7 women and 2 men. And by the time I was leaving 4 years later, you're always ranking lists on who's coming in. You had to look really hard to find men that were qualified to beat out the 3 lists of groups of 9 women that were in there. So it really turned the tables around that time. So in the late 80s, early 90s, came here, your group had a female, the group I joined had two different females that had left, had Jenny Garber-Crest, who moved back to Wisconsin a year after I was here. So there were, 30 years ago, there were just two of us as females in the field of OB/GYN. And we had, what, 30 people in the department about in terms of OB/GYNs at that time. And now it's shifted quite a bit. There's a couple males, but not very many.
There was an interesting episode of All in the Family in 1970 in which Gloria, the daughter, comes in and she gives them a riddle, and she said, so young boy goes in with his father in the emergency ward, and the doctor attending looks down and says, I cannot operate on this child, it's my son. Who was the doctor? And the entire 30 minutes is coming up with completely random scenarios of he was adopted, and that's the other father, it's the grandfather, but he thinks it's this, like, every possible scenario until finally Gloria goes, it's the mom! At the end. And it literally, like, everybody is shocked by that. And even in the audience. And I think about the transition from 1970 to now, where you couldn't tell that riddle without everybody going, well, wouldn't it be the mom? Like, that's a 1-minute show. It's a fascinating change. And I just think, you know, there are some really interesting dynamics as well with not only sort of the diversification of medical staff, but also the, again, increasing sort of narrow focus, so that team medicine becomes a thing, and you have to build a digital model and a team model so that if I'm working on a patient, I know everybody else who's working on that patient, I know everything that they're being prescribed. And this is, you know, where I think Northwestern has really played a role in where the hospital has gone with my chart, with the way you're able to use digital material, digital tools. So for both of you, that had to be a transition, right? You had to learn this system in order to be able to navigate it over the course of the last, whatever, 10 years of digital changing.
And then you had to change that system because it changed in there for the whole system too.
So we had to learn it when we were moving into the new hospital.
Right, so we started a new EMR the day we opened the new hospital, so everybody had to train for learning the new hospital, as well as the new Epic is probably the most widely used, but we were on a different system to begin with. But what was interesting, I was out in Colorado for training, and in 1988 we were putting information at the bedside into computers for computer chart. We got here a lot later than that, so that was 34 years ago.
Was it the black screen with the orange type on it? Was that the
Pretty much, but before that even, in the county system, a patient could show up once and get seen and get labs and get a visit, and when they showed up into the county hospital, if they'd been seen once, it was the pet project of one of the older physicians there. He had a really basic computer, and so there would be a checklist that when that patient came in, there had to be a checklist done, and at the end of the night, there were 40 people that had come in. There was a girl that put all of that into a computer, so when the patients came into the county hospital, if there was one visit or there were 15 visits, we had their information there, and that was unbelievable then. So now we complain about it, but then we kind of loved it. So
yeah, the transition to electronic health records, that was the cause of all this gray hair. It was not easy, and I think probably many of you have experienced, there is an art now to going to the doctor and not having them just do this, ask a question, sit there typing, and never looking at you. And I'm sure all of you have probably experienced it, and it's something that we actually continually harp on with nursing staff, that with our patient care techs and the physicians, about treat the patient, then put your stuff in the computer. Learn how to do that, because we learned very quickly, especially by surveys, that was a very negative experience when the doctor was more interested in typing on their computer than they were in interacting with me. The other thing I want to point out, this was the first time in the U.S. that anybody opened a new hospital and a new electronic medical record at the United States before.
Now, do you know why? Having gone through it?
It made Y2K look like nothing. So,
Dr. Bauer, you told us a story about a gravestone that you saw in Utah that I found absolutely fascinating.
and I think George has a picture I sent him. It goes back to a subject near and dear to my heart and pretty much every pediatrician, which is vaccines. So we were doing some hiking out in Zion, and we went to sort of an old ghost town called Grafton that was now deserted, and there is a cemetery, and I took a picture because it listed the people beginning in the late 1800s who had been buried there. And the first 10 or 12 people, it all said, what did they die from? Diphtheria, 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 diphtheria. Then there was a scarlet fever. There were a couple unfortunate killed by Indians. But I've used that slide in my vaccination talk to show how many people actually know what diphtheria is, or know somebody that had diphtheria. And that's because of vaccinations. And sorry, but you're going to see me get on my soapbox a little bit now. That unfortunately, vaccines have been so successful that they literally are the greatest single medical breakthrough in our lifetimes. They have saved literally millions of lives. And unfortunately, there's been a time now where it's turned to people have started to fear the vaccine because of the internet, urban legends, stories, because they no longer see the diseases that they cause. And I really want to drive that home. When I was training, and again, I came here in 1988, so I did my training from 85 to 88. I saw routinely, every night on call, we were doing spinal taps for children with bacterial meningitis, largely due to 2 different bacteria. Okay? That's routinely. If you ask any pediatrician that's come out now in the last 15 to 20 years, most have never seen a case of spinal meningitis. That never. Or they may have seen 1 or 2, and Jen knows what I'm talking about. So you went from routine to virtually nothing. And that's largely because of the pediatric vaccines, the 2 particular bacteria, Haemophilus influenza type B and the pneumococcal. Now, everybody gets their pneumonia shot here, right? That's against the pneumococcal bacteria. But it used to be a devastating illness for children. And I can't stress enough the importance of that. So let's do quickly a bit of trivia. Who knows where the term vaccination came from?
Cow milk.
Okay, you know the story? Well, so it comes literally, it comes from, I don't speak Latin other than igpe heavenly, but it of or from a cow.
Yeah, Baca.
Yeah.
The BACA is Baca.
French and French, Vache is French.
Yes, right.
So back in 1796, Ed Jenner was considered the father of vaccines. He actually coined the term vaccination. They had noticed that when there were smallpox outbreaks, which would be quite devastating, that a large percent of farmers, and farmhands, and milkmaids didn't get it. They didn't suffer. And he hypothesized that, well, they're exposed to cowpox. Cowpox was a similar but much less deadly disease that would infect cattle, and they would get the blisters on their udders, and if you were milking them, you would then, as a human, get cowpox, which was not devastating. But he found that probably protected you from getting smallpox. So what he did, he took a woman that had cowpox, opened up those lesions, took the pus from them, found himself an 8-year-old boy, scratched his arm, and put it in that scratch. What happened? Lo and behold, 4 days later, that boy got cowpox on his arm. 6 weeks later, he exposed him to smallpox. And guess what happened? He didn't get smallpox. And that was the beginning of vaccinations. So he's the father of vaccinations. Then we got to quite a long time, the early 1900s, where you started getting diphtheria and then tetanus and pertussis, or whooping cough, and they were all separate, and it wasn't until the 1940s that they were able to combine the 3 vaccines. And then shortly after that, in the 60s, we developed vaccines for measles and mumps and rubella. In between them, we'd already talked about the polio, and those became combined, I think, late, probably about 1969 or 70, you started getting the MMR. And then along came a study in 1998 that appeared in the medical journal, The Lancet, by an English physician, although I hate to even call him that, and Andrew Wakefield. And that's what started the whole controversy of, does the MMR vaccine cause autism? That was in 1998. Now, I think everybody knows that that's a fear that is still perpetuated today, that what most people don't know, it was a study that only included 12 children. Only 12 children. And the study was completely flawed for a number of reasons. It was subsequently found, not only was it flawed, it was fraudulent. Because he manipulated the data, he falsified it, and that study was eventually retracted by the journal. 10 of his 12 co-authors also redacted their statement, and he was ultimately the equivalent of a lawyer being disbarred. He was kicked out of the medical society in England. Yet the damage from that study of only 12 children fostered that urban legend. And what happened, unfortunately, there were large measles outbreaks because the rates of vaccination went way down. England suffered large measles outbreaks. We still see pockets of it here today. The same thing happened with mumps. So why am I telling you all this? Hey, I think it's an interesting story, but sort of fast forward now to the last 2 years with COVID and COVID vaccines. And fortunately, we have this thing that's close to a miracle of an effective vaccine. Prior to that, the fastest a vaccine was ever developed from the time research into licensing was 4 years, which was really very quick in the late 60s for the mumps vaccine. But think of what we were able to accomplish within a year. Yet you have all these kind of false stories going on about it. So the moral of that story is you can't necessarily believe all this information, especially now that we have this thing called the internet, where stories just fly around.
So we have 2 hooks on that. One is Jill got to participate in a panel we did quite coincidentally 6 months before the COVID outbreak on pandemics and epidemics and how they are managed. And then we actually developed, so if you're interested in vaccines, we actually have a couple of pieces on our website that were from presentations. They're on the history of vaccination and the history of epidemics. It's a fascinating history. One of the most interesting, which we actually had as a program, was on the polio vaccine, because one of the things that happens during the polio vaccine is they go to mass manufacture. They don't have the standards that we have today. The FDA doesn't really exist in the form that it is today. This is one of the things that drives it. And so there's a manufacturer in California who does not successfully kill the polio virus in the vaccine, and 48,000 kids are exposed, of which 8,000 kids get polio and several hundred die in a 9-month window. And when they realize what's happening, they shut down the entire manufacturing, they stop for a year, and then they have to do this massive propaganda campaign because they still need people to go in, and parents still line their kids up. They're like, great, let's go. Parents' fear of polio overrode their fear of any vaccine at that point. And so one of the things I think, and again, we can talk about what this does, and is what one of my favorite cartoons over the last year was somebody who drew a picture of a cemetery and wrote the "I did my own research" section of the cemetery. And
was his name Aaron Rodgers? No.
And one of the things, so the blessing of Google and the internet is the ability to access information. But as my brother always says, they didn't call it the valuable information age, they merely called it the information age. And that one of the things patients can do is Google whatever they want and walk in and say, this is what I found. And the ability to sort of filter, are you pulling this off the NIH, or are you getting this off of some site? And as doctors, you have to navigate this all the time, right? The "I did my own research" crowd.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. I think it's getting better now because people are much more savvy and they know. I mean, they're going to have people that are going to follow. I've got my ivermectin at home and I'm not going to do the vaccine no matter what. And they are pretty intelligent people, so it's really hard to figure that out. But I think when the internet first happened and you would have somebody come in bug-eyed, oh, I've been surfing all night long. I'm like, surfing? I didn't even know the term at the time. And then I realized, I'm like, you did this for 8 hours last night? And there wasn't that much out there at the time. But then you had people coming in with reams of paper things that they pulled off. And that was actually really hard because you couldn't keep up with what they were doing. But science got better at it too, in hospitals and, Mayo's site and up-to-date. There's really good sites you can refer patients to now, and so it's easier to weed through today, and sometimes they bring in a question that you didn't think about, and so what was really laborsome trying to figure it out on the front end of how are you going to fit this volume and kind of navigate through what they're asking on the question because they don't really know what the question is, to just all of it to now sometimes it's actually really helpful to us, I think, so, which is interesting.
It is interesting, and I mean, I will say, I love being able to actually go in and pull National Institute of Health papers to see what is the latest research, what do they know about anything my family is tackling, so that I'm at least a more informed listener than I'm talking to the doctor about, any treatment that my mother or my aunt are going through. I want to make sure that we have time for the audience to ask questions. So we've got maybe 10 minutes left. I would love to know if you all have anything you would like to ask any of our panelists. Pam, shockingly, is first.
The women's sport has been going on for 75 years. How much influence do they have over decisions with the medical things that are happening in the hospital?
The last part of your question, Pam, was?
How much influence does the women's board have on the choices of things being done in the hospital?
I think that's a great question because it's evolved through the years, and if you look at the original pictures, women on the women's board were really charged, and Maddie, jump in here because you probably know more about the history from your mom's stories, but just making people feel comfortable and thinking of ways to raise money and ways they could raise money. And then we went through a big stage where we had several businesses in town, and that money we earned so we could kind of drive where the money went in the hospital. And now with our partnership with Northwestern, which has been amazing, the team at Northwestern to see exactly where the funds are needed, because the hospital growing is strategic. So we can't just, they don't need what would be an example, like a baby warmer or something maybe we would have done in the past. They need supplies to help, babies that come early. So we're told, here are the things we need, and you can pick what you want to fund or support from that. But one thing that I think we've really done well is start the grants program, which has helped in ways that we can drive for people at the hospital who don't get their needs funded, but still want to, go for it. So we funded, crash cards not crash cards, kids cards for kids in the emergency room. We've done the Cool Cap, which helps women. We had a woman come from Indiana just so she could not only get her care at Northwestern Lake Forest, but not lose her hair while she was getting chemotherapy. It's a cap that I think, and the doctors would know way more about it than me, but sort of freezes the follicles, doesn't it?
Yeah, it allows them to minimize hair loss during chemotherapy, but it can be very expensive. Of course, insurance companies, your best friends, they don't want to cover those things. So that was one of the great women's board grants. Another, Jill, I don't know if you've had the opportunity with any of your patients. We now have the ability to do fetal monitoring that wirelessly, so mom doesn't have to stay hooked up, and that was a new grant that I know our midwives have been using. Have you had the chance to use that at all?
We used to have the ability with that years and years ago, but it didn't work as well, so I didn't carry it over, so that's good.
Yeah, no, it's been wonderful for the Women's Board.
And a great partnership.
A great partnership, because we can literally go to the doctors and the nurse practitioners and all the clinicians and say, what do you need that we can help fund? And then, of course, we provide our scholarship program, which is the other half of that. And Maddie, you're so involved with that, as your mother was before you.
Well, we've been doing the scholarships for 70 plus years. And it has helped. We used to give them to a lot younger people throughout the community, and even some high school kids who thought they might want to be a nurse or a doctor. And we've had to narrow it down, and now we pretty much fund scholarships for existing staff who want to and or need to further their education. Because, now help me here, doctors, we have to, the nurses have to be of a certain level in order to practice it, to be on staff at Lake Forest Hospital, and so the scholarships help fund their further education so that they qualify.
That's all part of our being what's called a magnet designation. And for those of you that don't know, it would be like, what's the restaurant term when you get that highest? Yeah, it's like being a magnet designation for nurses is like being a Michelin star rated restaurant, and a lot of the funds go towards our nurses to help them in their education.
Well, and the volunteers, I think the day-to-day volunteers are so important. And I remember Bill Reese saying years ago at one of our Women's Board meetings that with the amount of time that the Women's Board and the volunteers give to the hospital, it's equal to the salary of 10 full-time staff. And so without our efforts, not just raising the money, but changing rooms in the CCU and standing at the truck hall, it helps, yes, a lot.
Other questions?
Did that answer him? Oh, good.
David?
Was the baby alumni party too successful? Is that why it had to end?
Well, I was chairman of it for 12 years.
It's your fault.
Yeah, my fault. The when we first started, the hospital dietary department was furnishing the food, and the women's ward was paying for the rides. But originally, the Marcy Farwell would ride across Waukegan Road on her pony and give pony rides. I mean, it was that loving hands at home back then. And right when I took over a McDonald's franchise from Deerfield, furnished Ronald and all the food, and we pink ladies were out there having fun too, but I think we just paid for the rides at that point. And then McDonald's went away. And Northwestern came, and it just changed. And we had too many babies.
Yeah.
We had...
There is no such thing.
I'm sorry. That's, yeah, their bread and butter, and I'm sitting here saying too many babies. But I think at one point, wasn't our baby count 2,300 babies in 1 year? Yeah, and when the party first started back in the 50s, I think there were 80 babies, or, you know, I mean, it was just, it's phenomenal. So, we were 260, you guys do too good.
I'd like to just add one thing, kind of as an aside. When we were talking about Dr. Proxmire and some of the older doctors that were there. When my husband, who lived in what was Scotty's studio, it's now part of the Altunian building. It was a 3-story house, and Dr. Proxmire came to the house because my husband, his sister, and his dad all had mumps. And he said, Dr. Proxmire said to my mother-in-law, "You're going to take care of these all together. You don't have beds enough downstairs." He went upstairs with her and took beds apart and brought them down. Above and beyond. So, just a little sidebar.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, that is amazing.
I'm sure Dr. Bauer would do the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
Forgive me, but the thought that went through my head when you were telling that story was try and get a millennial to do that.
Yeah.
Oh, they would just want the target to get the air mattress.
And so,
Any other questions? All right, well, I would like to invite George up for some final words. I want to say thank you to the panel for another really lovely medical presentation. We do really well with these, and I am always pleased to see the breadth of the conversation that we get across. And this, I thought was very well done. Thank you.
I want to encourage everyone to look around, not just at the History Center's permanent exhibits, but we have some fun posters of Women's Ward over 75 years, and behind you and out in the lobby, our archivist found the hospital's 100th anniversary photograph collection, which is out there and kind of fun to reminisce.
And I just want to thank everybody for coming. I texted Maddie at 5 o'clock and I said, I'm scared to ask, is anybody coming tonight? So thank you all for being here. It's very lovely of you to take the time. We appreciate it.
And thanks for having Dr. Holden and I. It's a privilege and an honor to be able to be here and do this. It really is. It's also nice to see some old faces. It's nice to see any faces. But thank you. It really is a privilege to be here.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Well, we couldn't agree more, Doctor. Thank you so much to all our incredible panelists for tonight, Maddie, Debbie, Dr. Holden, Dr. Bauer. Without all of you, this, of course, would not be possible. So again, thank you all for taking the time out of your evening and making our first in-person program back at the History Center a resounding success in my book, to see all these wonderful faces and to be able to have these experiences, because it's panels like these and stories like these that are the real history, I think, and that's what we should continue on and what we hope to continue on. So like I mentioned before, if anyone is interested in future programs, we have a lot of exciting things coming up for the duration of 2022 and beyond. I'm sure a lot of you might have heard news about certain grants being awarded to the History Center. We're very excited to be developing an incredible set of programs centered around African American history and archival of that, section of history that will be made free because of our ability to, promote these future programs and to have those kinds of awards brought very graciously to the History Center. So all that information can be found online on our main website. A couple things, just like I noted at the beginning, tours will be coming back, and next Saturday, I wanted to mention too, we'll be having our 4th iteration of what we call Little Historians, which is a program dedicated to children 5 to 9 years old in collaboration with the Lake Forest Library. So if you are aware of any aspiring historians around that age, we ask you to welcome them into the History Center. It's a monthly program that will be conducted on a variety of different subjects. So once again, everybody, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for attending for tonight and getting a chance to listen to all these spectacular panelists. So.